Hello, friends. Welcome to the Case for Life program. Delighted to have you with us today. Well, I did it. This last weekend, I blew up the internet unintentionally, but I published a piece on why so-called equal protection laws harm our efforts to save children. And as you might expect, there were a lot of abolitionists and other people who did not like what I wrote. Here was the thesis of what I argued. It is not prudent in a culture that already thinks the pro-life movement hates women and wants them to die, to lead with legislation allowing women to be prosecuted for murder. And I thought I was making a pretty reasonable statement, one that was modest. If you think about the culture right now, we have red states like Montana, Ohio, Missouri, Kentucky, that either won't vote to protect unborn children or are writing abortion into their state constitutions. And if we can't even get red states on board, why are we leading with legislation saying we want to prosecute women for murder? And I didn't even make the argument we should never do it. I just said right now isn't the time. I limited my critique to that point. And you can go look the piece up. It's at the Gospel Coalition if you want to. And there were responses from it. And one of the responses I got was from a friend and colleague, Seth Gruber, who used to work for us at LTI. He's now off on his own. I forget the name of his organization, but he is a pro-life speaker. And he wrote a critique of what I wrote. And I was a little surprised by it. So I thought we'd talk about it with a good friend of mine, Jonathan Van Maren of the Canadian Center for Bioethical Reform. You may have seen Jonathan's work at National Review. He's a prolific author. How many books have you written, Jonathan? At least 4, right?
I think 6.
6, okay. Wow, I'm stuck on 3, so you got me beat, you know. And you have been just one of the best thinkers out there in the pro-life movement. So I thought I'd bring you on, not so much to bail me out, but I want to hear your thoughts on these equal protection pieces of legislation, and in particular, what some of the criticisms were of my piece, so that we can kind of get a sense of this. Now, I have to admit to you, I was a little surprised by Seth's response. I was surprised by the tone of it, number one. It's quite condescending. It's quite sanctimonious. For example, he starts off by saying, Scott shifted out of his lane this week with a poorly reasoned article on political strategy. Now, I don't know why it's out of my lane to comment on political matters when I've been in the pro-life movement for 35 years. I think I have something I can say to that. And you know, it's interesting, if I had wrote a piece saying I agreed with Seth, they would not be saying I was out of my lane. They'd be saying, what a great piece. And they'd be applauding it and saying, look, this pro-life apologist with 35 years of experience has weighed in on our side. Isn't that great? But no, because I disagreed with them, I'm suddenly out of their lane. And I went through the piece honestly looking for something substantive that would have refuted my general thesis that it's not prudent to lead with these equal protection bills right now. And I didn't see it. So let me ask you, I didn't prep you for this question. Am I missing something here?
No, I've actually been kind of surprised by a number of pieces that have been written in response to your piece, including Gruber's. And your piece, was written in plain English, well articulated. So if somebody disagreed with your argument, it wasn't hard to find the argument that you were laying out. And there was a lot of ping-ponging around and kind of objecting with, as you pointed out, condescension, but a lot of sort of active irritation to the points you were making. And this kind of goes, it goes to what it's always like to argue with the abolitionist flavor people when it comes to their case, is they have 2 separate arguments and they go back and forth between the 2. The first argument is the moral argument, which is that it's essentially fundamentally immoral and unbiblical to pass anything but an equal protection law. And then secondarily, it's the only strategic thing to do. And they focus more on strategic now, but the difficulty is when you address the strategic argument that they bring up, and if they believe you've had a good argument, they pivot back to, well, even if it's strategic, it's immoral. And so I find it very difficult to kind of pin down and systematically go through the arguments that they're making. And I saw that in spades in the responses to your piece.
Yeah, it's interesting. I once asked an equal protection advocate, if you were the governor of a state that passed a ban on abortion protecting all unborn humans from conception, but that piece of legislation did not allow women to be prosecuted for murder, would you vote to protect the babies from abortion, or would you veto the bill because you couldn't punish women? He said, I would veto the bill because we owe our duty to God before man. He was willing to let those children die if he couldn't punish the women involved. And I just found that beyond belief.
Yeah, I've heard very, very similar things. And a similar argument years ago, a couple of the primary abolitionist leaders admitted to me that under their definition of abolitionism and under their moral code for voting, one could not vote for Abraham Lincoln, which I thought was revealing. The one who actually got the Emancipation Proclamation, which was an incrementalist measure, as you've noted before. And so that kind of, it divides into two camps, because I always quote our mutual friend Mark Harrington of Created Equal. He says, I am in this movement to reduce the body count. That is the sole reason I am in this movement. I'm in the movement because I saw images and then a video of an abortion, and that convicted me to join the pro-life movement. Mark Harrington has a very similar story. And so I think that every tool in the toolbox that is ethical or biblical is permissible to reduce the body count. And if that's the argument we're having, I think we can lay out pretty definitively why equal protection laws don't actually accomplish that. But then you get mischaracterization, right? They're saying, well, why would you want to zig and zag when you could go straight to the goal? And the argument, of course, is we're not zigging and zagging because we like exercise. We're zigging and zagging to avoid obstacles that will ensure it takes way longer to get to the finish line. And so our steel-manned argument would be, you're going to get to the goal of protection for preborn children faster incrementally than you are by beating your head against a brick wall and getting defeated at the ballot level on the state level year after year.
Yeah, I see that. Now, jumping to some of the specific things Seth brings up, I'm going to just stick with the major ones that at least approach the level of an argument or a response. A lot of this amounted to you're just kind of cowardly, you're not brave enough to live out your convictions. If we only had Christian men who would stand up and fight like the prophets of old, we could do this kind of thing. One of the things he says is that you look at the church fathers, you look at Basil the Great, you look at Tertullian, you look at others, they advocated for legal penalties for abortion. Could you address that? Because I did some research on this too, but I'd like to hear your thoughts first.
I think one of the pitfalls of going back to early church history and trying to extract very specific political prudential advice from the 3rd century AD, it's risky for all kinds of reasons. We're talking about an entirely different historical epoch, an entirely different paradigm, and each new generation of Christians has to decide how to apply Christian principles in the day and age when they're living in. So you can extract boldness, right. You can extract witness, you could extract a commitment to the protection and the sanctity of all human life. But to say, well, this is the strategy they pitched in the Roman Empire, so this is the strategy we need to pitch in the American Republic, which is rapidly post-Christianizing and has been at an extraordinary rate since the 60s, only leveled off in the last couple of years. There's epistemological problems with that political approach, to say the very least. It's also worth pointing out that the examples cited, especially when we're talking about 374 and the legislation passed by Valentian at the urging of Basil of Caesarea, that we're talking about an empire that's rapidly Christianizing and turning from the Roman Empire into Christendom, as opposed to the epoch we find ourselves in now, which is a post-sexual revolution, once Christian America, that is now very, very different. And so, you hear a lot of talk online about knowing what time it is. I think that's advice that we need to take, especially in the context of looking at what is possible in the pro-life context, because bad history makes for bad strategy, and bad strategy means more babies die.
Exactly. In fact, I've been reading Carl Trueman's new book, The Desecration of Man, and he makes a very powerful point in there. Our society is not just dealing with a passed down secularism. Rather, we're dealing with a rush to desecrate the sacred, to get rid of any limits that might inhibit our godlike powers of constructing ourselves however we want. That's a very different culture than what we found in the time of the church fathers you just mentioned. But I also came up with something else. I decided to go ahead and look at this because when I read Seth's piece, I was kind of struck. I thought, wait a minute, this isn't what I remember from my grad school courses on church history. So if you look at someone like Tertullian, Yes, he did say that the lex talionis, the law of retribution in the Mosaic law, applied to ending the life of an unborn human. But the context matters here. Tertullian was answering Roman officials who were accusing Christians of doing secret crimes like murdering infants and small children. And Tertullian's response was, how can that even be possible when we condemn abortion? In fact, if you go back to our earliest foundational truths in the Mosaic law, we argued that the lex talionis applies to killing children in the womb as it does outside. Why would we be guilty of killing children secretly who are already born? That context matters. That wasn't mentioned in Seth's piece. Now, when you look at Augustine, it's not much better in this sense that he argued that there were stages of development that mattered. He drew a distinction between an unformed child in the womb and one that was formed, and he argued that the unformed ones that are killed, that's not murder. That's not murder because they're not yet formed. If you look at Justin Martyr, he called for ecclesiastical penalties, but not legal penalties for women who abort. John Chrysostom was the same thing, ecclesiastical, not legal penalties. So when Seth says that all of these early church fathers pushed for legal penalties, that's really not quite the truth if you go ahead and actually look at the history. Athanasius doesn't mention penalties at all in anything I could pull up on his writings. Basil the Great, again, ecclesiastical penalties, but not legal penalties. He also, interestingly enough, argued that we should show leniency to women who have abortions because oftentimes they are being pressured into it. They're being driven by fear, misinformation, and he actually lessened penalties as he went along in his service to the church. So again, I think we need to be careful here that we read our history carefully. And in this case, I'm afraid Seth did not.
I think what history tells us is that it's been messy. It's been complex. Yeah. Different people had different views. Cherry picking people to choose your views is always actually going to be pretty easy, although the pieces that I saw quoted didn't do that. So I think that people didn't look particularly hard. There was also sort of a steadfast and resolute commitment to avoiding the points that you actually brought up. And so, for example, even the case study that you mentioned, that you and I had talked about before, the case study of somebody who was fully pro-life, knew what abortion was, knew who the preborn child in the womb was, and yet ends up getting into a situation where she has an abortion in a red state with an equal protection law that has the death penalty. And aside from making some arguments that, well, maybe that woman wouldn't have actually had sex before marriage if she had been facing an equal protection law. There was a whole bunch of hypotheticals that we were given in response, but nobody addressed the reality of the actual hypothetical, which is in this culture, people are going to have sex outside of marriage, and as a result, they are going to get pregnant. We know that, which means that the example that you put forward that we've discussed before is an inevitability. And in every country that has pro-life laws right now, work your way through Latin and South America, work your way through the few countries in the West that still have abortion regimes, countries like Malta, Ireland pre-2018, Northern Ireland pre-2019, is you have abortion activists who are hunting for cases like this. They are hunting for one of two kinds of cases. They're hunting for a Savita Halappanavar case to make the case that you can protect women or you can protect babies or not both, or they're looking for a victim that they can use to let the entire public know that pro-life laws are cruel to women. I'm not saying that they're right. Obviously, you and I would both agree that those are wrong. I'm not suggesting that every woman is innocent or that every woman is a victim. I am most certainly not. In fact, the case study that I put forward explicitly notes that the woman had an abortion in full knowledge of what she was doing, so she would not be guiltless and she would not be an additional victim. At the same time, we have to look at how these cases are not only going to be used in the United States, but how they are currently being used in South America and Latin America. There's one point to make here. I remember I was at a post-Roe, a Roe v. Wade is dead party in Washington, D.C. with a whole bunch of different pro-life leaders the weekend that Roe v. Wade was overturned. And a couple of people mentioned, we've got CNN and the New York Times calling us to ask whether or not we think women should be imprisoned, what kind of penalties you think that that women should suffer for having abortions. And they were talking about how good it is that they're getting phone calls from the press. And I remember thinking, when did we suddenly trust the New York Times and CNN? If they're interested in your answer to that question, it's because it helps them, not because it
That's
helps
right.
you. They didn't suddenly get interested in the intricacies of your theonomy or why not women should actually be penalized for having abortions. They're interested because by quoting you, they know they are driving down the vote that you need to actually pass legislation in the first place. And so I think pro-lifers should wake up and realize that these discussions are hurting us. CNN knows it. The New York Times knows it. We should know it too.
Exactly. And, to go back to that Steelman example that I borrowed from you in my article, let's imagine this 18-year-old Christian girl. We'll call her Lily, like I do in the article. That's convenient, right? Lily is raised in a Christian home. She knows abortion is wrong. She's seen abortion videos. She actually won speech contests on abortion in pro-life events. But at 18, she goes off to the secular university. And as we all know happens all too often, she meets a non-Christian guy she falls head over heels for. Physical lines get crossed, and she's pregnant by Thanksgiving. She panics and takes the abortion pill. Now, there's no denying she knows abortion is wrong. We both agree on that. But imagine the cameras in that courtroom and the images sent to the American public for weeks of a devastated family, Lily crying and weeping, and that emotional argument going out to a culture that's untutored on moral thinking and on abortion arguments. What is going to happen to pro-life legislation for the near future, if not the long-term future? Dead on arrival, if you can excuse the pun, right? Now, imagine you're a pro-life politician and you have to defend that courtroom scene on the campaign trail. You can just see what happens here. Legislation that might have protected children from being killed now has no chance because culturally we shot ourselves. And I want to get back to something you said earlier, that there's this tendency to say, we don't care what the consequences are, we're going to obey God. Well, my response to that is stupid for Jesus is still stupid. And I'm thinking of a biblical example here, Josiah, a very righteous king. He even sparked a revival in Israel. Well, he did something really stupid. He ignored just war theory, and he went out and took on Pharaoh's army when Pharaoh's army was passing through Judea on its way to Assyria, and Josiah gets killed. God did not bail him out for being foolish. So the fact that we have good principles, that we're committed Christians, does not excuse us from thinking prudently. And that brings up another thing I want to talk about historically. We often hear that people like Lincoln and Wilberforce, why they didn't worry about prudence. They just did the right thing and they weren't worried about being seeker sensitive or being popular or liked. Well, first of all, we're not seeker sensitive. I think people throw that term around without even knowing what it means. The seeker friendly movement intentionally told church leaders, don't talk about certain issues. Don't talk about abortion. Don't talk about sexual morality because you'll turn off people from coming to church. And it caused churches to become marketing strategists rather than being pastors who proclaim truth. Well, nobody here is saying we should downplay the reality of abortion. We're having a prudential discussion on what the penalties should be, and we think the prudential concerns matter. Now, I would like you to address this. Was Lincoln a guy who threw prudence to the wind, or was he very cautious in the way he approached the abolition of slavery?
Well, he was so cautious that the abolitionist Wendell Phillips once referred to him as a first-rate, second-rate man, which I thought encapsulated his strategy very carefully. The example of Lincoln and the abolitionists, I actually think, is a pretty good case study for today in a whole bunch of different ways. You had abolitionists who were speaking truth to power. You had the William Lloyd Garrisons running the Liberator, referring to the U.S. Constitution as it permitted slavery as a compact with the devil and a compact with hell. And then you have Abraham Lincoln, who looks at the space given to him as Garrison and the abolitionists move the Overton window, and he moves up behind them, but he's always behind them. And the same thing is true, in my view, for the pro-life fight. Is my organization works to show the truth about abortion victim photography to millions of people every single year. And so we are the cutting edge of the Overton window. We are the people who are speaking truth to the culture. We are showing people what is actually going on, that abortion is an act of violence that destroys the body of a human child. And it's politicians who are supposed to be coming up behind us, not leading the charge. The argument in response to this often is, well, you need to actually have a moral witness. You need to have politicians who pass laws, and laws become a moral teacher. And the reality is you actually have to get those laws passed, and you have to keep them passed. And I just do not see the cultural analysis that clearly a lot of the equal protection advocates have bought into. And I've talked to some of them, and I think they're truly sincere in this, but I just don't understand how they think that the current cultural conditions would permit a law like that to be passed and held in place without triggering a backlash that would essentially give you nothing. Because if we're going to try and say, we're going to take all or nothing, congratulations, you're going to get nothing. That's what's going to happen.
Yes, and of course, their only answer, at least Seth's answer here, is, come on, basically man up, show some courage, be that leader. If we had more people who were leaders like us in the abolitionist movement, you'd actually see change and you'd be able to sustain these laws. And my response is, how? I think about a guy like Lincoln. Lincoln did not arrive on the scene in 1850 when he sort of quasi-launched his political career, saying he was for full abolitionism. In fact, he made it very clear that if he was ever in power, he would only move to limit the expansion of slavery in federal territories.
Yes.
And he made it clear, I'm not even going to go to the southern states and deal with it there. Was that compromise, or was that being prudent? Well, it turned out it was prudence, because Lincoln understood that if you could limit the expansion of slavery in federal territories, when those territories eventually became states, they'd be free states, and the electoral map would shift in favor of the abolitionist, and you would get a chance at getting rid of slavery. He was playing a long game, in other words. He was thinking very prudently. Now, a lot of people say, well, Lincoln was never an abolitionist. He just wanted to preserve the Union. That's a bunch of crock, because if all he wanted to do was preserve the Union, he would have signed in 1860 the Crittenden Compromise, which would have reunified the nation immediately, avoided civil war, but it would have done so while leaving slavery in place. And Lincoln said, nope, not going to do it. Lincoln was very prudent on when he released his Emancipation Proclamation. He had to deal with copperheads in the North that had no interest in getting rid of slavery and really were much more sympathetic to the institution than some of the Southerners were. Lincoln had to walk an incredible balancing act, and he was very prudent at what he'd say at sometimes and what he wouldn't say at sometimes. He knew how to walk that line. And it's funny because even an abolitionist no less than Frederick Douglass said at Lincoln's funeral that were it not for the president's wisdom and prudence in carefully moving forward the case of abolition, it would have never happened. And that's coming from Frederick Douglass, not from an evil incrementalist like us.
Yeah, like Greg Cunningham said many times, we need to be bold and bright at the same time. And sometimes discretion is the better part of valor. And I do think some of this is, our culture is so badly poisoned. Our culture has become so decadent in so many different ways that there is a certain catharsis in just saying what is true, saying it the way that we want to say it, and saying it very loudly. And I understand that. But as somebody who works for an organization that has thousands of face-to-face conversations with people every single year, when you get a sense of where the culture is at, then you understand that we're going to have to do this street by street. Everybody always uses World War II analogies because they want to have the moment where, the atom bomb drops and the war ends. This isn't World War II. This is World War I, where we're going to have to win it trench by trench by trench. And that's going to take a lot of excruciating and grueling hard work. But it's also just the way that social reform movements always unfold. We don't get the magic bullet right away. And I noticed a lot of the arguments in the articles responding to you also weren't particularly honest about the way American pro-life history unfolds either. I think The Story of Abortion in America by Leah Savas and Marvin Olasky is a book that everybody should consider reading. It's a great book. But there were people who were saying, well, there were 16 states in the U.S. that allowed criminal penalties for the women. But they didn't note that there was only 2 prosecutions in the 20th century, one in Pennsylvania and one in Texas, that these laws were not actually enforced that way, that the abortionist has always been the primary perpetrator targeted for legal ramifications for a whole range of different reasons. One of them being that it's difficult to determine the moral culpability of somebody having an abortion for a range of reasons. When you spend all of your time on the streets talking to people about abortion, you realize that there's people who know exactly what they're doing, that they had an abortion or more than one, they knew it was a baby, they did it anyways, and they're happy about it, and they're willing to talk in the most disgusting terms about it, and they deserve to be in jail, no doubt. There's other women, and this is a very common reaction, they see a photo of an aborted baby and they're horrified, and the response you hear over and over and over again is, I never knew. I never knew. There is a difference in moral culpability between those two people, and
our
a lack of
jurisprudence treats them differently. Yeah, absolutely. We've got just a few more minutes. In fact, what we're going to do is take a break real quick right now. When we come back, I want to take a moment to talk about what I wish Seth and others would have written in their response to me that I think would have added to the conversation. We'll get to that point in just a minute. We'll see you after the break. Hello, friends. You may not have time to read a full-length treatment of abortion like I've done in this book, The Case for Life, the second edition, but you may have time to take what amounts to 7 sessions, a week's worth of study if you want to do it day by day, to learn how to defend your pro-life views persuasively. We have a basic course that will help you do just that. You will learn how to make a formal case for the pro-life position. You will learn how to defend it with science and philosophy. Even with non-Christians, you can make a case for the pro-life view. Then we'll teach you how to handle objections, how to recognize the 5 bad ways people argue about abortion, and how they often bring up things that are beside the point. You'll learn to keep the main thing, so that you're in charge instead of feeling like you're in the hot seat whenever the issue of abortion comes up. Visit the website for details. Welcome back, everyone. I mentioned before the break there was a question, or I should say a response I was hoping to get from Seth Gruber, and it would have been this. Hey, Scott, I read your piece. I have some thoughts. Here they are. And it would have been nice to see, for example, a statement like, hey, we've got polling data. We've done some research on how the population would respond to an equal protection proposal, and we actually think you've misread the public, and here's why we think that. Okay, that's a fair response, but to just say, hey man, you don't have Christian courage, man up, doesn't really refute the points I brought up. Your final thoughts on this, Jonathan?
I agree completely, because obviously equal protection is the long-term goal, and if somebody can make the case that this is actually feasible and maintainable, that it's the fastest and most prudential route to saving the maximum number of babies, then I welcome that research. But to make this about testicular fortitude rather than about actual strategy, I think was a rhetorical as well as a strategic mistake.
Yeah, I was disappointed to see it. Well, anyway, thanks for joining us today, Jonathan, and thank all of you for watching. We'll see you on the next show.